There's a moment when you realize the world doesn't see you anymore. You're just in the way. For Richard Calloway, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in a bank that smelled like bleach and broken promises. Rain hammered against the windows as Richard, 72 years old, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, slid a withdrawal slip across the counter. The teller, a young man with gelled hair and a smirk that hadn't earned the right to exist, picked up the paper like it might be contaminated. Richard has always feared that he would outlive his retirement money. $82, the teller said, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. That's all you have? The murmur of conversation died. Richard felt every eye turn toward him, like searchlights finding a prisoner trying to escape. His throat tightened, and he managed a small nod, trying to keep what was left of his dignity intact. The teller leaned back in his chair, making a show of scrolling through Richard's account on his computer screen. "Sir, are you sure you can even count? Because this account's been flagged for insufficient funds 3 times this month. 3 times. Richard's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Please, I just need enough for—" "Another fossil who can't manage his pennies." The teller's voice rang out like a bell announcing execution time. Laughter rippled through the line behind Richard, actual laughter. Someone pulled out their phone, and Richard heard the distinctive chime of a video recording starting. His face burned with shame so hot he thought his skin might peel away. Richard fumbled with his worn leather wallet, trying to find his identification, and that's when it happened. A thin strip of faded red ribbon slipped from between the worn folds and fluttered to the pristine tile floor. It landed silently, but to Richard it might as well have been a gunshot. He stared at that ribbon like it was the last photograph of someone he'd lost, because in a way it was. Kept it for 30 years, he thought to himself. Kept it because once, a long time ago, it meant I mattered to someone. Richard bent down to retrieve it, his knees cracking so loudly that fresh snickers erupted from the crowd. His arthritic fingers scraped against the cold tile, finally grasping the ribbon with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for driftwood. The teller wasn't finished with his performance. He stood up now, waving Richard's bank statement in the air like evidence at a trial. "Look at this, everyone. Overdraft fees, late payment charges, returned check penalties. Sir, you don't need a bank account. You need a guardian. Someone to manage your finances, because clearly you can't." The manager stood in the corner, arms crossed over his pressed suit, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He made no move to intervene. Why would he? This wasn't his problem. Richard was just another number, another inconvenience, another old person taking up space in a world that had moved on without him. Richard's voice cracked when he tried to speak again. I worked 40 years at the plant. I just need enough to—" The teller leaned in close enough that Richard could smell the coffee on his breath, and dropped his voice to a whisper hiss that somehow felt more violent than shouting. "Come back when you have someone who actually understands money. Or don't come back at all." Richard turned. The walk to the door felt like crossing a desert. Every eye in that bank was on him. Phone cameras tracking his humiliation like it was entertainment, like his pain was content to be consumed and forgotten by tomorrow. The automatic door opened in slow motion, revealing the downpour beyond, and Richard understood something in that moment. That's when I understood, he would think later. I'd become invisible. And the only thing worse than being invisible is being seen like this. He stepped into the rain, and the door slammed shut behind him with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Richard walked 3 blocks before he realized he was crying, the rain on his face mixing with tears until he couldn't tell the difference anymore. His apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a man with $82 to his name. Dark, cramped, the smell of mildew had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. Richard sat at a small table that wobbled no matter which leg he tried to stabilize, eating cold soup straight from the can, because heating it seemed like an unnecessary luxury. Behind him, pinned to a corkboard with a rusty thumbtack, an eviction notice screamed in red ink. 7 days. He had 7 days to come up with money he didn't have for a place he could barely call home. Richard laid the red ribbon flat on the table beside a faded photograph, its edges soft from decades of handling. In the photo, a teenage girl with tear-streaked cheeks held the same ribbon, her eyes wide and frightened. Richard's hand was visible on her shoulder, steady and protective. Her name was Elena, Richard thought, staring at that photo like it might speak to him. I found her crying behind the market on a Saturday afternoon. She was 14, bruises on her arms shaped like fingerprints. She was scared, so scared, and alone. The memory came flooding back with the clarity of yesterday. Richard in his 40s, still strong then, still useful, kneeling beside a teenage girl who was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She clutched her ribs like they might fall out of her body. "You're safe now," Richard had told her, his voice firm and certain in a way he couldn't manage anymore. "I promise you're safe." He'd taken that red ribbon from his daughter's old craft box, the same daughter who'd grown up and moved away and called twice a year, if he was lucky, and tied it in Elena's dark hair. His hands were steady then, kind, capable of fixing things. Elena had gripped his wrist so hard her knuckles turned white. "Don't leave me," she'd whispered, her voice raw from crying. "Never," Richard had promised. But time has a way of breaking promises that people make with good intentions. Richard's phone buzzed on the table, jolting him from the memory. Unknown number. He stared at the screen, watching it vibrate against the scratched wood surface. It rang again, insistent. Against every instinct screaming at him not to answer, Richard picked up. "Richard?" The voice was female, low and warm, but there was something unsettling underneath it, like honey poured over broken glass. Richard's mouth went dry. "Who is this?" "You don't remember my voice," the woman said softly, almost sadly. "But I remember yours. Every word you ever said to me." Panic clawed up Richard's throat. I don't understand. How did you get this number?" "You told me I'd be safe. You promised me." There was a pause, and Richard could hear breathing on the other end, steady and patient. "Do you remember that promise, Richard?" Before he could answer, the line went dead. Richard dropped the phone like it had burned him, his heart hammered in his chest so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. He rushed to the door, checking the locks, sliding the chain, turning the deadbolt with shaking fingers. Then he moved through the apartment, turning off every light, plunging himself into darkness. He sat by the window, curtain barely cracked, breathing shallow and quick. Outside, the street was empty except for rain and shadows. For the first time in 50 years, Richard thought, I was afraid. Not of dying. At 72, death seemed almost friendly compared to this. No, I was afraid of something worse. I was afraid I'd become the target of something I couldn't understand. Morning came too slowly and too fast at the same time. Richard hadn't slept. He'd sat in that chair by the window, watching, waiting for something he couldn't name. When the first grey light of dawn crept through the blinds, he saw it. A black Mercedes, sleek and expensive, the kind of car that didn't belong in his neighbourhood, idling directly across the street from his building. Richard's breath caught in his throat as the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out, and even from his third-floor window, Richard could see she was striking in a way that made the dreary morning seemed somehow darker by contrast. She wore a tailored black coat that probably cost more than his last 3 months of rent combined. Blood-red heels clicked against the wet pavement, and around her neck a thin choker, crimson as fresh blood, the exact shade of the ribbon that sat on his table upstairs. The woman looked up, directly at Richard's window, and smiled. Richard jerked back from the curtain, his heart racing. This isn't happening, he thought. This can't be happening. But the knock on his door came 30 seconds later, 3 firm raps that echoed through his tiny apartment like Judgment Day arriving early. Richard opened the door before she could knock again. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. Up close, the woman was even more striking. Late 30s, with dark eyes that held something ancient and dangerous despite her youth. "Hello, Richard," she said softly. Richard stepped back instinctively. I don't know you." The woman's expression shifted, something that might have been sadness flickering across her features. "You don't remember me, but I remember everything." She held out her hand, palm up. In it lay the red ribbon, the same one Richard had dropped at the bank. "You dropped this, just like you dropped it the first time, when you saved my life." Richard's breath stopped entirely. His eyes moved from the ribbon to her face, really looking now, searching for something familiar in features that had matured and hardened. "How did you dropped it then, too," she continued, her voice gentle now, almost tender. "When you knelt down to help me. When you stood between me and someone who wanted to hurt me. When you tied this ribbon in my hair and told me I mattered." The memory slammed into Richard like a physical blow. That teenage girl, sobbing behind the market, the way she'd flinched when he'd first approached, the bruises, the terror in her eyes. And then the way she'd looked at him, after he'd helped her, like he'd hung the moon just for her. "Elena?" Richard's voice was barely a whisper. Her eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. "You gave me a reason to survive. And I survived, Richard. I survived everything." Richard felt his own tears building, decades of loneliness and isolation cracking like a dam preparing to burst. Why now, after all these years? Elena's expression hardened, the softness evaporating like morning mist. "Because I saw what they did to you. I was there, Richard, in that bank. I watched them humiliate you. I watched them treat you like garbage." Her voice dropped to something cold and sharp. "And no one gets to hurt you anymore." Richard backed away, shaking his head. "I don't need you to fight my battles. I'm nobody. I'm nothing." Elena stepped forward, matching his retreat step for step. "You saved me once. You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me what kindness looked like." She stopped, inches from him, her intensity almost overwhelming. "Now let me ruin the people who broke you." "I can't ask you to do that," Richard protested weakly. "You didn't ask," Elena said simply. "I chose. The day you tied this ribbon in my hair, I made myself a promise. If I ever had power, if I ever had the means, I would find you. I would make sure you never suffered again." Her smile was beautiful and terrifying. "It took me 24 years, but I kept my promise." After Elena left, Richard couldn't stop himself. He opened his ancient laptop, the one that took 5 minutes to boot up, and typed her name into the search bar. Elena Marin, CEO. The results flooded his screen like accusations. Marin Industries accused of hostile takeover. Whistleblowers silenced in Maren's scandal. Elena Maren, the ice queen who crushes competitors without mercy. Photos of her in boardrooms, surrounded by men in expensive suits who all looked vaguely terrified. Her expression in every photo was the same: cold, calculating, ruthless. What had she become? Richard wondered, horror and fascination warring in his chest. And what did she want from him? More importantly, what was he to her? A project? A debt to be repaid? Or something worse? Richard couldn't sit still. That afternoon, when he saw her car leave his building, he did something he hadn't done in years. He hailed a taxi and told the driver to follow that Mercedes. The driver gave him a strange look but complied, probably figuring Richard's money was good even if his judgment wasn't. They followed Elena's car for 15 minutes before it pulled up in front of a building Richard recognized with a sick jolt. The bank. The same bank that had humiliated him yesterday. Elena stepped out of her car, and the bank manager came rushing out like his life depended on it. The manager actually bowed like Elena was royalty. And she didn't smile, didn't acknowledge him beyond a slight nod. She just walked into that bank like she owned it. Because she did. Richard understood that now with perfect, terrible clarity. Richard stumbled out of the taxi, forgetting to pay, the driver's shouts fading behind him as he lurched into a nearby stairwell. His chest tightened, a vice crushing his ribcage from the inside. His vision blurred at the edges. I thought she was going to take the only thing I had left, Richard's mind screamed at him. The only thing those bastards in the bank didn't take. My dignity, whatever scraps of it remained. He clutched his chest, gasping, sure this was it. This was how it ended. A panic attack in a dirty stairwell, alone, forgotten. Just another old man whose heart gave out because the world was too much. But he didn't die. Eventually, his breathing slowed, his vision cleared, and when he made it back to his apartment, Elena was waiting for him. You followed me, she said. Not a question, a statement of fact. She was sitting in his kitchen chair and like she belonged there. Richard's defenses were gone, burned away by fear and exhaustion. I needed to know if you were dangerous. Elena stood, moving toward him with the grace of a predator. Only to people who deserve it. She sat beside him on his threadbare couch, close enough that Richard could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle. I don't need your money, Richard. I have more than I'll ever spend in 10 lifetimes. Then what do you want? Richard asked, his voice hollow. Elena reached out and touched his wrist, the same wrist she'd gripped as a terrified 14-year-old girl. Her fingers were warm against his papery skin. Your permission. Richard pulled away, shame flooding through him. I'm 72 years old. I'm broken. I'm used up. I don't have anything left to give anyone. Elena leaned in, her voice dropping to something intimate and fierce. You have everything. You don't understand, do you? You taught me the only thing that matters in this world, that someone cared, that I was worth saving. Her eyes searched his face desperately. And now, I'm going to show you what that's worth. I'm too old for games, Richard said weakly. Eleanor's lips curved into a smile that made Richard's heart stutter for entirely different reasons. Good, she whispered, her fingers tracing the prominent veins on the back of his hand. I don't play with boys. The silence between them crackled with something electric. No one had looked at Richard like that in 20 years, like he mattered, like he was more than just an inconvenience waiting to die. Elena saw him, really saw him. and somehow that was more terrifying than anything else. Drop a comment. Is Richard the victim, or the reason she became a monster? Like and subscribe.